I am finally free of this burden. Starting today, my parents are moving into my house. It was supposed to be a relief, a new page, but every step that led us to this day was covered with a network of pain and loss, gained in a long series of mournful events. My parents, who once became an immutable symbol of stability for me, have remained in my memory as an example of an indestructible family. They were ordinary office workers, hardworking and humble, who devoted their lives to making sure that my brother and I grew up in love and care. We were the most normal family, and probably it was in this simple normality that all our happiness lay. I grew up, became the eldest daughter in this family, and when I turned 30, I married Scott, a reliable and calm man with whom we lived for many years in peace and harmony. We had 2 children, Eric and Judy. Scott and I, immersed in work and education, did not notice how quickly time flew by, and now the children have grown up and started their own lives. Eric and Judy lived far from their parents' home, built careers, started families, and I could finally feel free from constant responsibilities. My husband and I were preparing for a new stage of life, for quiet evening conversations and leisurely walks, enjoying the silence that had fallen. But this calm picture, this illusion of serene old age, was shattered one cold winter day. My father was in a car accident and died almost instantly. He was only 68 years old, an age when life can still bring joy and light. Our family went into mourning, but my mother suffered the most. It was as if she had disappeared inside herself, locked in grief so that she could not even touch food. Mom, I know how hard it is for you, but you need to eat. I tried to reach her, again and again persuading her to at least eat a little. I know, but I just don't have an appetite, she replied with such desperation that it seemed to me as if her heart was literally stuck in her throat from the pain. My brother and I thought that it would pass, that over time her heart would heal from the loss. But as time went on, my mother's condition got worse. Her face was rapidly losing color, her body was losing strength, and her eyes became dull, as if immersed in another world. I was shocked by her changes, and one day, unable to stand it, I took her to the hospital. The doctor's diagnosis was like a lightning bolt for me. Cancer, late stage, inoperable. She had about a year to live. The shock enveloped me like a dense fog. Before I could mourn my father, I found out that I was now losing my mother too. I told Scott that I wanted to live with my mother. I couldn't leave her alone, either emotionally or physically, especially now, when the disease was depriving her of her last strength and will to live. I understood that my care would not restore her health, but at least she would know that there was someone nearby who would truly support her to the end. But Scott's reaction stunned me. He listened to my words in silence, and then, sighing heavily, said with obvious irritation, "We just finished with your father's funeral, and now I have to get involved in other problems of your family." His words, cold as a knife blade, froze in the air, and it seemed to me that at that moment the walls around him began to shrink. I barely recognized my own husband. "You don't have to say that," I protested carefully, trying not to escalate an already tense conversation. "Can't you just take her to the hospital and back? Do we really need to live with her?" He looked at me as if I was asking him to give up everything in the world for my family. "She may feel lonely, and that will be fine. Maybe I can just live with her, in my family home, until she gets better," I added, hoping that this would somehow soften his mood. But Scott just got indignant, looking at me like I was a kid who didn't understand the obvious things. "And then who will take care of me? Who's going to cook my food while you're gone?" He looked at me sternly, as if all my duties were written in stone. I tried to calm him down. "I'll come and cook, Scott. And I'll take over the cleaning. Just please understand." But his reproaches continued. "What about the laundry? Who will do this?" He was harsh, and I fell silent, confused. I was going to do my best, as before, but the reality was that, faced with the need to take care of my mother, I just couldn't tear myself apart anymore without sacrificing either his comfort or my peace of mind. Through the silence that hung over us, I felt my heart tighten, and although it hurt to admit it, it increasingly seemed to me that my desire to take care of my mother was perceived as an act of selfishness. Someone might have said that I put my interests above my husband's, and that, of course, upset me. After all, my mother was always attentive, always thought that everything was fine, even when she needed support. Now that it was time to take care of her, I had to do my best. Okay, Scott muttered reluctantly, giving up. But I'm not going to help, do you hear? His words sounded like an order, like a rebuke. I suppressed the urge to object and thanked him quietly, even though everything was boiling inside. His attitude seemed arrogant, but still I was grateful for his agreement. We started living with my mother in my family home, leaving behind the housing provided by Scott's employer. Scott was the only child in his family, and his father always wanted us to move in with them eventually. Scott and I did not plan to buy our own housing, as living in the company's house was not only convenient, but also economical. The rent was only about $11,000 per month, an amount that did not put a heavy burden on our budget. But now that we've moved into my house, the need to pay rent has disappeared, and we have more space where my mother could find some peace. I thought living with my mother wouldn't be that difficult for Scott either. Despite his initial resistance and firm statement that he would not help in any way, I still hoped that he would relent over time. True to his word, Scott really wasn't involved in taking care of her, but I was glad that I was able to be with my mother to ease her days and share with her at least a little warmth and comfort that she hadn't felt for so long. With each passing day, her strength was running out. At first, she tried to hold on, trying not to show weakness, but increasingly she had to rest during the day, and her days were spent mostly in bed. I cooked food for her, fed her, helped her take medicine, all the things she couldn't have done alone. She often thanked me for my help, each time repeating how sorry she was that I had taken on such a hassle. "Amy, thank you. You can't imagine how much it helps me. You and Scott are a real blessing in my life," she said with warmth in her voice, unaware that her words offended me. She sincerely believed that Scott was also grateful for the opportunity to help, although he never showed the slightest involvement in her life. One evening, after I put my mother to bed, Scott came home and we sat down to dinner. I decided to carefully bring up the subject of her treatment, hoping that he would at least listen to me. That evening, I really wanted to talk to someone, put my worries into words, share the weight that was weighing on me, maybe get some advice or support. But in response, Scott gave me an annoyed look and said, "I do not know what you want from me." I said I'm not going to delve into anything, right? I didn't insist, realizing that any of my words would go unanswered. 2 months passed, then 3, and Scott's attitude did not change. He continued to complain about the inconveniences of living together, as if he was doing a great favor by enduring our family tragedy next to us. His behavior became more and more cold and dismissive, but I tried not to get into arguments, concentrating on dealing with everything on my own. Between caring for my mother and trying to keep the peace at home, I felt stretched to the limit, and my whole life became unbearably stressful. 5 months later, her condition deteriorated sharply and she ended up in the hospital. Despite the fact that I knew about the inevitability of the outcome, when it happened, when her heart, barely fluttering in recent days, froze, I felt an emptiness, as if a piece of my soul had been torn out. My family, my brother, my adult children, immediately responded, surrounding me with care and support. At such moments, it was especially important to see your spouse next to you, to feel his warmth and the hand extended to you in the darkest hour. But Scott didn't share my grief. I noticed him in the corner, next to his parents, laughing and chatting as if nothing had changed. My brother took over all the organizational matters, and thanks to him, the funeral preparations went as smoothly as possible at such moments. Everything was ready, and despite my fatigue, I was sure that I would find the strength to say goodbye to my mother with dignity. But looking around before the ceremony began, I suddenly noticed that Scott was sitting at the very end of the hall, away from the family section, while his place, no doubt, should have been next to me, with our children, to support us in this bitter hour. His action amazed me. "Scott, I want you to sit in the family section," I said, quietly, restrained, but with bitterness barely concealed in my voice. I told Scott that his place was next to me, in the family section, but he replied with cold indifference, "No, I'm fine here, I'm not a blood relative." His words cut me like a thin, sharp knife. "But you're my husband," I objected, trying not to cry. But before he could reply, his mother intervened, looking at me with her usual disapproval. "He's your husband, but he's not your mother's son. Scott is our son, which means he's an outsider here." Those words hurt more than I could have expected, and I felt like I was burned by the heat of resentment and disappointment. It was as if an invisible wall had grown between Scott and me, between what I considered family and their cold, detached interpretation of those words. I stood there in mute amazement, unable to find an answer. In my family, my son-in-law has always been considered an integral part of it. He sat in the family section, supported his wife, shared grief with her. But this time Scott left me alone, leaving me to the questions and whispers of the guests, who looked at me in disbelief, as if they did not understand what was happening. Someone from distant relatives started whispering, wondering if we were divorced. Gossip and speculation filled the space around me, and the pain of their gossip became especially sharp. After all this could have been avoided if Scott had just sat next to me, even for a moment showed that he was ready to share this bereavement with me. Despite everything, we managed to say goodbye to our mother with dignity. My family, brother, children, and even Scott and his parents returned to my house after the funeral to share this difficult, bitter silence that descended on our house, now deprived of its light. I discreetly thanked them all for their presence, offered tea, trying to be hospitable, despite the inner fatigue that seemed to weigh down in my chest. One of my relatives smiled and replied, "Oh, Amy, this is a family, of course we are here. But first of all, it was your burden, first your father, now your mother. These funeral expenses." He hesitated, pretending to be sorry, but there was undisguised bitterness in his voice. I froze, stunned by his words. "A burden?" I whispered, not believing he'd said it out loud. I forced myself to smile, but inside I was seething. What did they mean by that? Did the death of my parents become something burdensome for them? I apologized and quickly walked away to calm the shock, but then I heard Scott talking to his parents. "It must have been hard for you, Scott, living with strangers and putting up with all their whims," I heard his mother say. "Yeah," Scott chuckled. "Amy sometimes goes overboard with her demands. A husband shouldn't just follow his wife's wishes. If he doesn't like it, he has every right to say no." The words echoed, and I couldn't believe I was hearing this from someone I once thought was close. I clenched my fists, feeling the anger rise in me like a wave covering me completely. Their cold voices, laughter, sarcastic remarks, all this was unbearable, but it was no longer new. Scott's parents have always been brusque and rude, and since our wedding, I've learned to be prepared for this. I remembered how on the day of our wedding, his mother, squinting at me, threw, "Couldn't you have found someone more attractive?" And his father, picking up on her sarcasm, added, "Oh well, beauty gets boring after 3 days. There will probably be some fun with Amy." Then, stunned by their bluntness, I glanced at Scott, hoping that he would support me, be outraged that he would stand up for me in front of his parents. But instead, he just laughed, as if he was amused by their remarks. I realized then that I could not count on him as an ally, as a support, but I thought that time could change everything. Neither Scott nor his parents said a word of comfort to me, either on the day of my father's funeral or after my mother's death. Instead, they seemed to find a reason for ridicule and sarcastic remarks, even on such dark and difficult days. I was sorry that I had forced myself on Scott at all, dragging him into these trials, but now, implicitly questioning his character, I began to see something in his behavior that I hadn't noticed before. I had been worried about his comfort for too long, afraid of disturbing the peace, but now I began to understand that my desire to do the right thing for my mother should not have caused me to feel guilty about my husband, who turned out to be so indifferent. Listening to Scott and his parents laughing and chatting loudly in the other room, I could feel the anger building in me with every word they said. If my brother or the children had heard them talking, they would undoubtedly have been upset, but fortunately they were in the kitchen and didn't hear anything. I was the only one who caught this scene, and no matter how outraged I was, I couldn't afford to vent my emotions in front of them, so as not to overshadow their already sad day. Suddenly, my mother-in-law's voice was heard from the room. "Amy," she called, and I reluctantly turned around, trying to hide my expression of fatigue and irritation. "Yes?" I replied, trying to control myself. She was standing with my mother's purse, clutching it in her hands like some ordinary accessory. "Can I have this?" "What is it?" she asked, pointing to her purse. I was taken aback for a moment by her impudence and muttered, "Well, it was my mother's thing." But my mother-in-law just indifferently waved it off. "Your mom won't need it anymore, will she?" She smiled dryly. "Scott offered to take her home with me. Maybe I'll just keep her." I couldn't believe that she would allow herself to suggest such a thing on the day of the funeral. Gathering my courage, I stepped forward, snatched the purse from her hands and calmly but firmly said, "No, you can't." Her face froze for a moment, but not because of the purse itself, but because I, her daughter-in-law, dared to confront her. Apparently, she was used to my tacit agreement, but this time I wasn't going to give in. "We are not ready to sort out my mother's things yet, but later we will distribute her gifts to the family," I added, clearly feeling how my firmness scares and angers her. Her mother-in-law's cheeks flushed with anger, and she almost hissed, "What do you mean? Are you saying that I'm a stranger?" I looked at her intently and replied, "You said yourself at the funeral that even Scott was a stranger to my mother. So why should my family be considered outsiders now?" At that moment, Scott and his father, hearing my objection, also blushed, dissatisfied with my boldness. "Apologize to your mom, Amy," Scott hissed softly but urgently. "How disrespectful of you." Their loud voices and noise attracted everyone else from the other room. At that moment, I realized that I was standing in front of my mother-in-law, Scott and his father as an opponent, that my family, my children, and my brother had finally seen everything that I had endured for the sake of imaginary peace. My mother-in-law, crossing her arms, once again cast a reproachful glance at me, but not so confidently, feeling that everyone present had witnessed her inappropriate demand. The mother-in-law exploded with a scream, unable to contain her rage, and ran out of the room, leaving behind a heavy silence. Even Scott, apparently, did not expect such a turn. He followed her, and soon I heard him telling his parents his version of what had happened. A few minutes later, his father entered the room with a frown on his face and asked quietly but firmly, "Did you really call your mother-in-law a stranger?" I was surrounded by puzzled looks, and I realized that after hearing only her side of the story, everything happened as if in an inverted mirror, where I looked harsh and unapologetic. I gathered my willpower and began to calmly explain the situation, describing every moment, without missing a single detail. When I finished, my children, brother, and even some relatives nodded silently. Not a single person condemned me because they understood how important these things were to me. At that moment, the children came closer, hugging me and quietly saying words of support. I saw understanding and care in their eyes, and it gave me strength. They grew up in a house where grandparents were always there for us and always supported us. But despite this unity with my family, I felt that it would be very difficult for me to forgive Scott and his parents. Since that day, I have not contacted him or sought his companionship. Scott didn't try to talk to me either. Deep down, I didn't know if I would ever be able to forgive him for this breakup, but I felt that the situation couldn't stay like this forever. One day, a few weeks later, Scott suddenly appeared on our doorstep. "Welcome," I said softly, suppressing the anger and bitterness that flared up at the sight of him. I tried to speak evenly, even though his presence only stirred up memories. Scott, however, seemed strangely calm. Instead of the usual dry words, he took several envelopes out of his pocket and handed them to me. "Take the kids and go on a trip. It's a good way to unwind," he said, looking away, avoiding my gaze. I looked at the travel vouchers he held in front of me in confusion. Not expecting anything like this, I felt tears treacherously welling up in my eyes. Although the gesture was unexpected for me, it still touched me to the depths of my soul. It seemed to me that perhaps the idea did not come from Scott, but from one of the children, but the fact that he agreed to it was surprising. Immediately, I called the children, and we began discussing the details of the trip, as if it were a long-awaited adventure. "Imagine, it was your dad's idea," I told them with a smile. Judy was stunned, and Gary even whistled, not hiding his surprise. Perhaps there was more to this gesture than just a desire to show concern. Maybe Scott really understood his guilt. When all the preparations were completed, I started packing for the trip. Scott looked at me quietly and said, "I'll stay with my parents, don't worry. Just relax and spend time with the kids. You deserve it." I felt a surge of gratitude for his unusual act and nodded, although I was not sure that all the differences could be resolved with just one suggestion to rest. But deep down, I felt a quiet hope. Before going to the resort, I decided to visit Judy and Gary. Judy greeted me with joy and, as if sensing how much I needed support, hugged me tighter than usual. We talked about the upcoming trip, and her enthusiasm seemed to fill all the voids left by the difficult experiences of recent months. When I returned home after our relaxing trip to the spa with the children, I was overcome by a pleasant feeling of peace and warmth. Our days, filled with conversations, laughter, and warm hugs, seemed to erase the accumulated fatigue and bitterness of loss in recent months. I watched the children, their bright smiles and animated faces reflecting our shared joy. "It was wonderful, Mom, and really, it's worth thanking Dad for this once," Judy jokingly said, smiling. "Don't tell me Dad really thought about us with all his sincerity," Gary added with a grin. I laughed with them, and when I came home, I thought that maybe we still had a chance to start a new life with Scott. But as soon as I crossed the threshold of our yard, my hopes began to crumble. A picture unfolded in front of me that I could not understand. There was a gaping void where our family home once stood. The ground was flattened, as if the house had never existed, and everything around seemed alien and hostile. My heart started pounding faster, and as I looked around, I felt a cold build up in my chest. Scott appeared from the shadows, as if waiting for my return. His parents were walking behind him, their faces grinning and their eyes sparkling with undisguised self-satisfaction. I took a step forward, feeling my anger rising. "Scott, what's going on here?" I asked, trying my best to stay calm, even though my heart was pounding like it wanted to burst out. He looked at me with the same icy smile with which he had once looked at all my pleas for help, and said, "I'm finally getting rid of this baggage load. Starting today, my parents are moving into my house. My house. My memories. My whole world, which I had so carefully guarded, was disappearing like a morning mist. "What are you talking about, Scott?" I asked quietly, barely suppressing the shock that gripped me. He just grinned wider. "Didn't you understand?" the mother-in-law mocked, squinting. "Your family home was demolished. Now all the inheritance will go to Scott and us." At that moment, it became clear to me that this was their cunning plan. While I was trying my best to preserve our relationship and take care of my family, they were coldly plotting. The realization of this betrayal tore me apart from the inside, but at the same time something new came, a strange calmness and almost ominous confidence. I looked at the three of them grinning in front of me, and suddenly I was filled with frantic laughter. A bubbly, sincere laugh that broke out against my will, causing them concern. Scott and his father looked at each other, their complacency wavering for a moment. "Why are you laughing?" Scott asked perplexedly. Anger and confusion flashed in his gaze. "What a strange woman, she's just gone crazy," my mother-in-law whispered, looking at me as if I had become some kind of sinister mystery to her. At that moment, it became clear to me, I would no longer be a victim in this story. Through bitter laughter, I said, looking at their stunned faces, "You seem to have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't inherit a penny, so there is no inheritance, and there never was." After these words, I laughed again, and in this laughter disappointment and sarcasm were mixed. They were so confident in their illusory wealth, their imaginary inheritance turned into a trophy for them, which they thought would enrich them forever. Their wild imagination and greedy actions were so absurd to me that I couldn't hold back this hysterical, desperate laughter. Scott looked at me with bewilderment and anger. "What do you mean?" "Explain yourself," he demanded, straining at the fact that what was happening was getting out of his control. I, in turn, remained silent. I didn't need to educate them. They didn't deserve it. Scott expected me to humble myself and submit to their will, but now I was ready to end the seduction. "If you want to live together, live. But not with me. I'm not going to stay around people who only see me as an object for profit." The mother-in-law turned pale with rage. "You helped your parents around the house, but now you refuse to do it for us? Do you understand the conditions you're in?" she shouted, her eyes flashing. "You made the decision to live with me so that I would take care of your comfort, didn't you?" I added calmly, pointing out their hypocrisy. I saw her face contort with anger when I consistently rejected their claims and at the same time pointed out their hypocrisy towards the house. "You are ready to destroy family values for the sake of your interests. There are things that your selfish zeal should not touch." I shouted in a broken voice, and without looking at their surprised and furious faces, turned around, walking away. Scott called after me, "Where are you going?" I didn't stop, didn't turn around, and didn't answer. I couldn't stay in this place. I needed air, I needed to get away from the betrayal unfolding before my eyes. That same night, I turned to a lawyer, deciding that now I would fight. The demolition of the house, they explained to me, could not be carried out so simply. The house was still listed in my mother's name, which meant it was illegal to destroy it without my permission. When the lawyer began to sort out the details, a shocking truth surfaced. Scott and his father organized the demolition themselves, resorting to the services of acquaintances working in the field of dismantling, and even rented heavy equipment. They had thought of everything in advance, from the trip to the very last detail, in order to get rid of me and get the property unhindered. This realization, like a cold icy stream, swept through my entire being, and tears of pain and betrayal welled up in my eyes. How easily they decided to wipe off the face of the earth everything that was dear to me, without thinking about the consequences, without even considering it necessary to show at least a drop of respect for the memory of my parents. With difficulty restraining my emotions, I told the lawyer about all the circumstances that had happened. He listened to me with a knowing smile and then, with a hint of firm confidence in his voice, said, "Scott illegally demolished the house that rightfully belonged to your mother. He broke the law, and he can be held accountable for the destruction of property. We will demand an official apology, but we will not stop there." The lawyer wasted no time, and shortly after our negotiations, he sent a legal notice to Scott. A few days later, the phone rang, and I immediately realized that I was going to have an unpleasant conversation. Scott was furious, his voice was shaking with anger, and the words were coming out of his mouth with undisguised irritation. "What kind of notification? Are you crazy?" he shouted, clearly losing control. I answered calmly, almost indifferently, "You destroyed the house where my whole life was spent, and now you wonder what you have to answer for it. So, of course, you have to compensate for the damage." Scott snorted as if he was talking to someone insane. "Compensate? We agreed that we were moving in with my parents. The house was empty anyway, so I saved you the trouble. You should have thanked me, not demanded money." There was undisguised contempt in his voice. "Now return the inheritance and return home," he ordered, not even bothering to think about his words. "Thank you? For tearing down my house? Don't make me laugh, Scott. What other inheritance?" I replied sharply, abandoning my usual restraint. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to show the anger that was building up in me. Scott paused, apparently stunned that I had finally stood up for myself, that I, who had seemed meek for so long, had suddenly become unrecognizably determined. I continued, "You don't even know why I laughed when I saw that you demolished our house. Did you really think you'd inherit something?" I paused briefly, letting him process what I'd said. When my mom got sick, I was given a whole precious time to be with her. We had time to discuss everything. I told my brother that I didn't claim a penny, and I gave him everything. The money, the shares, everything went to him. The only thing left for me is the house that we were going to rent out. Either you and your father restore it, or pay the amount indicated in the notification. Otherwise, I will file a complaint with the police." Scott, as if taken aback by my words, whispered ingratiatingly, I didn't think you'd be so angry. Sorry. Of course, I will restore everything." He clearly didn't expect me to stand up for my rights. "Did you think that I would just turn a blind eye to the fact that you destroyed the place associated with the memory of my parents? Did you seriously think that by cleaning the house, you could avoid obligations to your parents and put all the blame for refusing to move on me?" I understood that his whole plan was to demolish the house, force me to be in need, and then, perhaps, even lead me to the idea that I had no choice but to move in with his parents. "If you're really sorry, Scott, then agree to a settlement agreement," I added firmly, knowing that I wouldn't let him manipulate me anymore. Closing my eyes, I ended the conversation by hanging up. Scott kept calling and texting, full of apologies, assurances of his regret. But his every "I'm sorry" meant nothing to me, an empty sound that didn't make it any easier. I answered one thing: "If you are really sorry, transfer the money." He tried to calm my indignation with words, but I was no longer going to tolerate this, expecting neither concrete actions nor compensation. My home, the place where my youth was spent, was destroyed forever, and no apology will bring it back. It was unbearable, but it was the only way to deal with what I had lost. While I was staying with Judy, my family supported me as much as they could. My brother, although furious at Scott's arbitrariness, assured me that he would not interfere, but was ready to support any decision I made. His words gave me strength, making it clear that I was not alone. My children were there too, condemning Scott's actions and encouraging me in my decision to seek justice. A month has passed, but no compensation has been received from Scott. During all this time, there was no contact between us, and I already understood that it would be ridiculous to expect payment from him. I couldn't stay with Judy forever. I needed money to start a new life. But then, when I least expected it, something incredible happened. One evening, Judy, looking at something on her phone, suddenly looked up and said in surprise, "Mom, look, this apron looks exactly like Grandma's." She showed me the smartphone screen, and I froze when I saw a photo of the apron in the used goods app. This apron was unique. I made it for my mom myself a few years ago. At that time, I embroidered each seam with special love, and it was one of a kind. My heart sank as I continued to view other ads from this seller. It looks like he recently joined the app. No reviews, no ratings, nothing. But to my horror, among the items on sale, I recognized many of my mother's favorite items: her jewelry box, antique porcelain figurines, and even several of her old books with marginal notes made by her hand. It was immediately clear to me who was behind it. Scott was the only one who had the opportunity to pick up his mother's belongings after the demolition of the house. I immediately dialed his number. He replied in an irritated tone, not even hiding his displeasure that I was bothering him again. "What's the announcement in the app?" I began, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "What are you talking about?" he replied, not paying attention to my words. But I wasn't going to let him get away with it. "Don't pretend, Scott. You're selling my mom's stuff without permission, aren't you?" My voice cracked with anger and contempt. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Scott spoke, justifying himself. "No, it's not me. I do not know what you're talking about." But I knew the truth, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. "Cancel these ads right now and return all the things," I demanded and, without waiting for an answer, hung up the phone. I immediately headed to Scott's parents' house, and Judy, seeing my determined mood, volunteered to come with me. A storm was bubbling in my chest, a mixture of rage, grief, and loss. When we arrived, Scott was standing at the door, as if waiting for us, a mask of feigned calmness on his face. I took a step towards him and, without giving him time to speak, asked with cold determination, "Where are my mother's things?" "I don't know anything about it," Scott stammered, but I wasn't going to give up. "Tell the truth," I demanded, feeling my anger boil up more and more. Judy came up to me and, standing next to me, joined in my words, increasing the pressure on my father. Scott looked worried, his eyes darting as if he was looking for a way out of this situation. At that moment, Scott's parents, hearing the noise, also came out onto the porch. "Oh, Judy, you're here." Scott's mother addressed her granddaughter, her face lit up with a warm smile, as if everything that was happening did not concern them at all. Judy, looking at her grandmother with anger and bitterness, snapped, "Grandma, tell Dad to tell the truth. He sells Grandma's things that were left after her death." Scott's mom laughed at these words, as if she had heard some ridiculous joke. Scott continued to pretend to justify himself. "It's not me. I'm not involved." But then his mother exclaimed loudly, interrupting him, "Is Scott selling?" "No, I'm selling everything." At that moment, my stomach turned cold. I glanced at Scott, and it was clear from his face that he had known about this all along. He apparently understood that this would not go unnoticed, but, not knowing how to tell me, he left everything to her discretion. Despite my shock, Scott's mother began to tell me with cheerful ease, "This is such a laborious job, imagine. You need to pack everything carefully, make the photos beautiful." "But I like it. I finally have a hobby that brings in a little money." She chirped as if she was completely unaware of what she was doing, as if she did not understand that all these things belonged to my parents and were part of their lives. Judy, barely holding back tears, begged her grandmother to stop. "Grandma, please stop. These are Grandma's things. You know how important they are to us." But Scott's mother remained indifferent to her words and casually continued, "Well, what's the big deal, Judy? I finally found an activity that I like. It's good for preventing dementia, you know. You want me to stay healthy and live a long time, right?" She said it so casually, almost with pride for herself, as if she did not understand that her actions were a betrayal. Realizing that talking wouldn't change anything, I took Judy's hand. "Come on, honey, leave them alone. We have nothing else to do here," I said, firmly leading her out of the house. We headed for the car, and I felt an unbridled mixture of anger and grief in my chest, but I knew that now it was time for me to act. I went straight to the police station. When we went inside, I explained to the police that my mother's belongings had been stolen and were being sold without permission. The police listened to me carefully and promised to act immediately. Within a few hours, Scott's mother's account in the app was blocked, and all the items that were put up for sale were taken off the auction. Now their easy profit will have serious consequences for them. On the way back from the police station, I dialed Scott's number. His voice replied in an irritated tone, clearly foreboding evil. "I blocked your mother's account. All her ads have been deleted," I said in a flat but firm voice. "You knew about it, didn't you? You are an accomplice in the theft." Scott didn't have time to find an excuse. He just started stammering, but I continued, "By the way, I filed a police report. I advise you to cooperate with the investigation." Scott was furious. "But we're a family. Please withdraw the statement, Amy." I chuckled softly. "Family? Is that what you're saying after all this? After still not paying any compensation for the demolition of the house, or alimony? Where was your remorse?" Scott paused, stunned that this was the first time I had stood up to him decisively. Despite everything, having lived with him for many years, I still felt for him a feeling mixed with pain and bitterness, but I was firmly convinced that I would not be able to forgive the theft. "Give me all my things back. And also, Scott, I saw your father. He's not well at all. I'm sure you noticed his condition?" I asked, unable to resist hinting at the weakness and soreness that I noticed at our last meeting. Scott didn't answer, and I hung up without waiting for an apology. Scott's father, indeed, looked frighteningly thin and emaciated. His complexion was unnaturally dark, and his eyes seemed extinguished. There was something disturbing about his appearance, as if the disease had already entered his body, but the family did not seem to notice it. Scott's mother was absorbed in selling stolen goods, and Scott himself was only immersed in cold calculations and ruthless words. They didn't really care about each other or anyone else. The next day, Scott's father unexpectedly called me. Expecting to be thanked for worrying about his condition, I replied, but his tone was steeped in anger. "What are you doing? Do you think I'm a weakling who can just be sent to the hospital and left there? Do you want to get rid of me so that you don't care?" he angrily reproached me. I tried to apologize, explaining that I was just worried, but he interrupted, "I'm not as fragile and short-lived as your parents." His words cut me like a cold blade, but I gathered my courage and only said a dry goodbye, ending the conversation. A few days later, to my surprise, it turned out that Scott's father really got worse, and he agreed to go to the hospital. The diagnosis was severe, incurable cancer. Shortly after that, Scott called me, in a trembling voice, informing me of the diagnosis. "Dad has incurable cancer." "Amy, what should I do?" I could barely keep from laughing bitterly as I replied, "I don't know, Scott. But didn't your father say that he's not as weak as my parents? Handle it yourself." Scott was stunned. How can you be so heartless, Amy? I didn't think you were capable of this. I sighed, barely holding back the pain that overwhelmed me. Scott, did you ever say a kind word when my mother was ill? You think about your own actions, I replied, and hung up, knowing that this conversation was no less painful for him than for me. Scott's father died soon after. As a human being, I did not seek to harbor dislike for the deceased in my heart, but the memories of how he and his family treated me and the memory of my parents made it impossible to cry at his funeral. After the funeral ceremony, a will was found, carefully prepared, despite his earlier words that he was not as weak as my parents. The will stated that their house would go to my son Eric, and the rest of the property would be divided between his wife and Scott. When I saw Eric's name in the will, I couldn't help but be surprised. Scott's father had always treated him with special warmth, wanting Eric to live with them, and now, even after his death, he apparently wanted to provide him with a home. I carefully told my son that he could give up this inheritance if he did not want to accept it, because it would bring the burden of taxes and responsibility rather than benefit. But Eric was glad to get the house, and I couldn't resist his desire. For him, it was not just a house, but a kind of symbolic right, and he was ready to accept it. Scott and his mother, in turn, did not object either. On the contrary, his mother-in-law expressed her approval, even paying inheritance tax, claiming that Eric would now become their successor. But I felt a little sad, as if Eric had been taken away from me, as if he had been wrapped in a network of other people's plans. But soon something incredible happened. A few days later, I received a call from Scott, who for some reason urged me to come to his parents' house. Not understanding what was the matter, I hurried to the place. When I arrived, I was greeted by a picture that stunned me to the core. Heavy cars and trucks with demolition company signs were parked in front of the house. Workers have already begun to dismantle the walls and ceilings. The house that Scott and his mother considered their own was collapsing before our eyes. "What's going on?" I exclaimed, barely able to contain my shock. But then, as if according to the script, Eric appeared from the crowd of workers, seemingly calm and even satisfied with what was happening. He looked at us and said, looking towards the house, "This is my house. And I can do whatever I want with it." Scott was shocked. He shouted, almost choking with rage and incomprehension, "Eric, what are you doing? Stop it right now." But Eric didn't flinch. "Even if I stop it, the house can't be restored to its former state," he replied coldly, not allowing either Scott or his mother to influence his decision. Scott's mother, holding back tears and trembling in her voice, pleaded, "Eric, please stop. This is our house, where your grandfather wanted you to live, as we all wanted." But Eric, without losing his composure, only laughed, bitterly and contemptuously. "Have you forgotten what Grandpa and Dad did to Mom? Grandma, you treated her terribly. Have you ever apologized to her?" There was a silence on these words, heavy and accusatory, as if every word of Eric exposed all those resentments that had accumulated over the years. The smile on Eric's face disappeared, turning into a cold, piercing look directed at Scott's mother and Scott himself. They were on their knees, lost, as heavy machinery inexorably continued to destroy their home, which they considered their fortress. I watched this scene with a sense of relief, as if many years of heaviness had finally lifted from my shoulders. Later, Scott, cornered, finally transferred the money as compensation for the damage, as well as for the stolen items that his mother had once taken from mine. Eric returned them to me himself, carefully, as if he were returning not just things, but a piece of my parents' lost world. "You will always have Judy and me by your side," he told me, and at that moment, for the first time in a long time, I let out tears of relief. Scott and his mother, having lost their home and a significant part of their inherited property, were now forced to return to the housing provided by the company, from where Scott and I once decided to leave together to build a more independent life. Now, having suffered such a fall, they have become the subject of discussions and rumors among colleagues and neighbors. Soon after, I explained the whole truth to the wife of one of Scott's colleagues, with whom I maintained a good relationship. Word spread quickly, and Scott and his mother found themselves in a difficult position, becoming the object of condemnation and sympathy, which are often especially bitter. Now they will have time to reflect on their behavior and reconsider their values. With Scott's retirement, life in the company's housing will no longer be possible, and they will have to save for new housing, rather than rely on someone else's property. I continued to live with Judy, but soon a joyful event happened. Eric got engaged. His plans were bright and clear. He was going to build his own house. We decided to sell the land on which my family home once stood, and the proceeds turned out to be decent. Even this land, which they tried to take away from me, eventually brought its benefits. Eric offered me to move in with him as soon as the house was ready, and I was warmly welcomed, making it clear that I was always welcome in their family. I accepted his invitation, realizing that I couldn't rely on Judy, who lived alone, forever. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I had found a new place, a new home full of love and care, which I had dreamed of so much. Sometimes I wonder how Scott and his mother are living now, but I no longer feel regret or sadness. I have my new family in front of me, and I am determined that I will never become the mother-in-law that Scott's mother was to me.